Hello and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. My name is James, your host. I started this podcast to help other folks share their own healing stories and to interview thought leaders and experts in the carnivore, keto, and low oxalate space. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Equip Foods and the Carnivore Bar. As an affiliate, you can use the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products when you check out using the code Carnivorist. Thanks in advance for listening, subscribing, and any likes or shares. And now, on with the podcast.
Dr. Bill, I did a brief intro before I had you join on here, but I really want to say thank you to you for all the hard work that you do in getting your message out there, your book, everything. We have a mutual friend in Casey Ruff from Boundless Body Radio, and I first heard your work through him as I was searching for ways to heal myself from years of vegan eating and a really malnourished state. I was very, very sick, actually, and I really want to thank you for everything you put out there. So what I would like to do, if it's okay with you, I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to start in a very unique place, which some folks may not do, at the conclusion of this wonderful book instead of the beginning. And I'm going to start by going and saying, there was a line there that really struck me where you said, if there's one lesson to learn from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, it's how to make the most of any situation. In other words, how to adapt. And I'll sort of combine that with asking you about your time on the National Geographic series, The Great Human Race, because it was so inspirational to me to watch that and all you went through. Can you tell us a little about the experience that you had on that show?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, and first, really, that line is a very, very important line, because one thing we do need to realize is that our environment is continuously changing, whether it's for humans, an iguana, a daffodil. The environments are always changing for every species of life on Earth. And the ones that make it through, the ones that thrive, are the ones that are able to adapt. And we find ourselves now in a very unique place in the modern world. We're living in 300,000-year-old bodies, but our environment, our context has completely shifted. And we have to find ways to adapt. We have to find ways to nourish ourselves properly, or else we're not going to make it through. But the one little caveat there that I want to mention, the unique thing about humans is that our adaptations are not just biological adaptations. Our diet, the way that we eat, is not, nourishing ourselves does not just mean we have to take in the right amount of nutrients and then we're fully nourished. We humans are incredibly cultural beings, and food is intertwined with everything it means to be humans. And because of that, we have to take everything about our modern food system, the way we deal with one another, our ethical considerations surrounding food, issues of sustainability, issues of religion, issues of politics, all of those things get wrapped up together in creating a nourishing life built around food.
Yes, sir.
So anyhow, thanks for starting with that line. Yeah, the Great Human Race was a magical experience for me. It was hard. It was incredibly difficult on me. It was incredibly difficult on my family. I was gone for quite some time and left my wife alone with 3 young kids. But it was transformative in a lot of different ways. And for one, I've been a college professor for over 20 years, and I had this, I have this dream that everything I would stand up and teach about in a class would always be based on personal experience. I always have some sort of personal experience. And for much of what I taught, that was the case. But as a prehistoric archaeologist, so much of what I talked about, I nor anybody in the modern world had any sort of experience with, firsthand experience. And doing that show, literally living the 10 most incredible, influential time periods in the history of our species and our ancestral species, really allowed me to then come back and teach in all different forms in a completely different way. Because, me and my cat star, Cat Bigney, we literally lived, again, it wasn't for like years on end. Each episode only took about 10, we were filming for about 10 days. It allowed us to actually experience in the closest way possible that we could, sort of a virtual time machine.
Because when I was watching the show, not only did I learn a great deal about what our ancestors went through watching you guys sort of walk those steps and create those tools. An example for me was just how important that fire was for our ancestors, and how difficult it was for you guys even to create fire back you were on the African plains, and just with the limited resources you were given. And once you created it, how precious it was.
Did you ever see the movie Quest for Fire? Yeah. I remember it came out when I was in kindergarten, and one kid in our class, Kevin Reed, was the only kid allowed to see it because there was a naked girl in the class or in the movie. But anyhow, I watched it when I was older. It is a great representation, and it was made in 1977 or something like that. But it was a great representation, I think, of what fire meant in the past, because the whole movie was based on the premise. Yeah, it's really hard to make fire, but once you have fire, you keep it and you never let it go out. There's one of our dear friends is one of the most famous archaeologists in Ireland. Incredible man. He's a little bit older. He has this gorgeous Irish accent, and he talks a little bit like Yoda, and he's wonderful. I just could hear him all day. But he grew up in this little tiny fishing village in the northwest coast of Ireland, and he said, "Listen, fire was important to it. They grew up without electricity, without running water." He says fire was incredibly important to us every day. It was where we got our warmth. It was where we got our light. It was how we cooked our food. It was what we gathered around. He said, but it wasn't until he was 30 years old that he saw his first fire lit. And I was like, what do you mean? For 30 years old, you had fire all the time. He's like, no, it never went out. Like, it never went out.
Another really powerful line
okay.
is in your book is our modern predicament is that we eat to obesity and are still malnourished. It's a really powerful statement. I'd just like to go back to how this all began for us as humans. And it really began, as you so eloquently said, with our ancestors striking two rocks together. And can you just expand on that and what it meant to us as humans and what we were sort of eating in those beginning stages? Because it ties into the bugs chapter in your book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do, I'm convinced. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book is allow us to reconceptualize what our dietary past really was and what it was all about. Just like we just talked about fire for a second and rethinking what fire means and how we use it. And if we start with that, the same thing with food. Right now, I'm convinced, because I was a part of this for a large part of my life, just like you mentioned what a vegan diet did to your health, what a carbohydrate-centric diet did to the majority of the health of my life was really problematic. I was one of those people that I think so many people probably watching this, so many of us, the trap we fall into, the idea that, when we look at food, we want, subconsciously to eat all day long and not get fat. Right, because eating is so social for humans. We do it. We sit at a bar and we eat. We sit and we eat and talk with friends. We watch the Super Bowl. We eat, and food is around all the time. And we like to engage in eating, and there's a reason for that, because we need to nourish ourselves. It's an evolutionary drive that But at the same time, that conception of that perception of our relationship with food is the complete opposite of what it's been for millions and millions of years. That idea that we're trying to seek out nutrient-free food is a brand new concept. And the result is we eat to obesity and we're still malnourished. In the past, we have something called an optimal foraging theory in anthropology, which means when we're trying to identify how different groups at different times went about feeding themselves, it's always based on optimum nutrition with the least amount of work. How can this group or this individual or this culture get as much incredible nutrition from their environment while doing the least amount of energy output in order to do that? That's the opposite of the way that we look at food today, but it's exactly the way I'm convinced our ancestors did. We started by eating, and bugs are a hot topic. In fact, I got a comment yesterday on social media about bugs. Somebody very upset that I was even talking about bugs in our diet, because it's been so politicized right now and polarized with the carnivore vegan community. But the reality is, bugs were an incredible part of our diet in the past. In fact, bugs were the staple part of our diet up until we started to introduce meat into our diet. So about 3.5 million years ago, we were eating bugs. Before that, bugs, some limited fruits, some limited vegetables, but our nutritional needs were incredibly low. So we could support our bodies on that diet. Bugs, out of those three things, were the most nutrient dense and bioavailable. Then we invented stone tools and were able to scavenge meat from carcasses on the savannah that were killed by other animals. And then that's about 3.5 million years ago, and that is fantastic. But for a couple of different reasons, it didn't make a huge dent in our diet. Could be because we maybe weren't doing it all the time, and it was kind of opportunistic when we were able to see another animal kill another animal, and we could run in there and get some meat. But it could have been also because even though meat is so much more nutrient dense than any vegetable on Earth, it is the least nutrient dense part of an animal. We see the biggest jump in body and brain size in our ancestors at 2 million years ago. When our ancestors started hunting, they became the apex predator. They were able to take animals down at will. And most importantly, they could access any part of that animal and use it for food that they wanted. They could eat the blood, the fat, the organs, and the meat, and whatever they wanted. So when we introduced all of the animal into our diet, our bodies and brains jump in size.
There's not a huge, but a growing rift between those folks, especially in the carnivore community, on cooked versus uncooked meat and the nutritional value associated with you. Now, I've heard you speak before on this and saying that it was the cooking of the meat that allowed us to access more of the nutrients in them. Is that sort of your stance on it, versus cooked versus uncooked meat?
Sure, but I think it's it's complicated. It's not as easy to eat. So one thing we have to say, I want to make sure it's laid out as a foundation before. Meat in any form delivers an incredible amount of nutrition that's not only nutrient dense but also bioavailable, right? So if we're comparing meat against vegetables, it's a huge distance. Once you get into that meat arena, right, into that animal side, forget about where else we're comparing it to, but cooked meat versus raw meat, there is a little bit of a difference. That difference is, it's hard to have a big screen here. That difference is minuscule compared to the difference between meat and non-animal foods. But once you're in that sort of meat world, especially with red meat, humans and primates in general don't do great with huge chunks of raw red meat. They don't maximize to the utmost ability of accessing the nutrition with the least amount of exertion, raw red meat. And a great example, I used to use this, and this information is coming from a fantastic primatologist from Harvard. He's done a lot of studies with chimpanzees and other primates. What he sees with chimpanzees is when they don't often kill, but when they do kill and eat meat, they always take this leaf, and it has a really high silica content in this leaf, and eat it at the same time as a raw red meat. And the idea is that there's so much silica in this leaf, and the way that leaf shreds, it actually shreds up the meat as they're chewing. It assists in them physically breaking down that food to access the nutrients on the inside. So what he told me was the best way to maximize the amount of nutrition that's coming from hunks of raw red meat is to physically break it down. So in other words, slice it thin, grind it up, something that assists in us being able to chew it, right? Physically breaking it down. And number two, a tiny bit of cooking. A tiny bit of cooking helps. Overcooking goes the other direction and causes a whole bunch of other issues, but just a tiny bit of cooking helps. So to me, if you are focused on getting the maximum amount of nutrition from hunks of raw red meat, with your body working the least, a medium rare or rare hamburger is like the ideal.
That's going to sort of segue into the next chapter of your book. And Dr. Bill, again, what drew me to you and what I really appreciate about your message is that you say, we're all coming from different places geographically, emotionally, economically, and you speak a lot to the chapter on animal meat in your book is more animal, less meat. And it just speaks to using, as our ancestors did, the whole animal itself, nose to tail nutrition, and how they prized a lot of the organ meats. The story you tell of the horse meat is an incredible one.
So it's really important, and this is another thing that's been sort of in the dietary world right now is so, and it has been for some time, so polarized that I really truly appreciate being able to sit down and have conversations like this where we can dive into the weeds a little bit to get at real good quality information, not just sound bites. The whole animal thing has gone in just months from something nobody was talking about to something that's gone too far in the other direction. And we have people suggesting that we should eat 50 pounds of raw bull testicles a day or something like this, which is just as ridiculous as eating no organ meats at all. And this is where I stand on. Number one, if you want to mimic at any level, and I'm not suggesting we take an ancestral diet and just stick it directly on our modern selves for a couple of different reasons. But if you want to be inspired by looking at a real comprehensive understanding of our ancestral dietary past and use that as a foundation for how to eat today, which is exactly what my approach is, then our largest jump in body and brain size, like we mentioned earlier, happens when we start eating the entire animal, complete nose to tail approach. So for maximum nutrition, getting the most nutrient-dense bioavailable food and diversity of nutrients in our diets, a complete nose to tail approach is spot on, makes complete sense. On top of that, if anyone listening or watching is also very interested in approaching food and their diet in the most ethical and the most sustainable way possible, then eating a complete nose to tail approach is spot on the best way to do it. If you're worried about economics and how much your food costs and bringing, and you know, how much it costs for you to feed yourself and your family the most nourishing diet possible, a complete nose to tail approach is spot on. And the list goes on and on. If you're doing that, you're probably connecting directly with local farmers. You're supporting people that are butchering in a very ethical way. I mean, all of that just makes complete sense. But the question that I've been usually getting lately, and this is, I think, one that we really start to need addressing now that this organ meat sort of thing is more in people's minds, is how much? Like, how much should we be eating? Because before it was, okay, the answer was, oh, we're not eating any because we're just going to go buy lean chicken breasts. That's what we're told. And we do. But now we are talking about, okay, maybe we should. I hate the word superfood, but people are suggesting, okay, the organ meats are superfoods. They're incredible foods. But we should eat some is good, so that means more is better. And now I can go buy 50 pounds of beef liver without even seeing a cow if I want to. So how much should I get? And the answer is, first of all, don't look to somebody else for the answer. To answer that question, how much of this? Think about what it would have been like if you asked a hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago, how much liver do you eat? And they would look at you and say, what do you mean? How much liver do I eat? You know this animal that I just killed? Well, I'm going to eat that much liver. And then I'm going to eat the spleen and the kidney and the heart and the tongue and the blood and the fat and all the meat. And I'm going to do this with the bones and the marrow. And then I'm going to go kill another animal. So that's how much liver I'm going to eat. But now we're so separated, from where our food is coming from. And we have this ability through the modern food system to go and buy 50 pounds of beef liver or 50 pounds of chicken liver and then ask how much we should eat. We have this dilemma that we created. So to answer that question, again, start to think about, number one, what can I do in my life that mimics what an ancestral pattern might look like? Like if you're trying to eat in a hunter-gatherer sort of way, then don't go and buy ribeye every night, even if you can afford it. That's ridiculous, right? And don't even just buy beef, right? The hunter-gatherers that we spend time on, they are always hunting. Even the way that, I don't want to get down a rabbit hole, but I'm a big hunter. My son is a big hunter. My father's a big hunter. We've been hunting since we could walk, but we go hunting. Like okay, it's deer season, Saturday. Let's meet up here. We're gonna get a cup of coffee. We're gonna go, and then we go hunting, and we pride ourselves on this. But that's not what hunting for hunter-gatherers are like. When I spent time with the Hods in Tanzania, every waking hour they were hunting. They were walking around with a bow. They didn't even know what they were going to get. So in their hands, in addition to the bow, they had 4 or 5 different arrows that had different tips on them, each designed for a different type of prey, one for a bird, one for a large mammal with a poison and whatever. And so they were always walking around, always looking, and they were always hunting. So they didn't eat one animal all the time. They got a big animal, they ate that till it was done to get another. So try to, first of all, connect with your food as closely as possible. Try to conceptualize what a hunter-gatherer life was really like and what foods they actually had access to, and then see what you can do when you're in the supermarket or in the farmer's market to sort of replicate that. And my biggest takeaway, or the 2 things are this, to try to answer these questions yourself. One is, if you have access to hunting, fishing, trapping, clamming, crabbing, whatever it is, do it. I mean, even if you do it once a year, you're more connected to your food than the majority of people on the planet. And number 2, even if you do or don't have access to that, buy the biggest cuts in the grocery store.
Watching you on The Great Human Race, and specifically the scene, where you spear the wild boar and also trap the beaver and eat the beaver tail, it just inspired me to become more connected and learn about hunting. And I'm honest when I tell you, I want to go out and learn to shoot a bow now, especially from being from a vegan background, and have that appreciation. So it's really important. And one thing I wanted you to touch on before we leave animals and go into one of my favorites is the plants, is how did awful become so awful for us? You often talk about, and I didn't realize till you talked about it in the book, the refrigeration technology that really sort of separated us from the organ meats.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. So I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
I put that out as an example of one of the things that in our history, in our recent history, that started to separate us from organ meats. But there's plenty of ones, and unfortunately, it's happened. And when it happens in certain parts of the world, then it spreads, and we see it all over the place. Unfortunately, continuing in that way. But refrigeration is a huge one. Organ meats are the most perishable part of the animal, and it is, and even when I saw it with hunter-gatherer groups in different parts of the world, again, just as an example, the Hadza, if they're killing an animal that's depending on the weather conditions, especially if it's warm, if they're killing an animal and it's a day trek back or a half a day trek back, and it's super hot, a lot of times the organs are consumed immediately. It's much easier, especially in certain conditions, to store fat and meat than it is to put organ meats in a storable condition. So they're usually eaten fairly quickly. And at the end of the Civil War, which I talk about in the book, we had railroads, thanks to the Civil War, I guess, all over the country. All over the country. We could ship things now all over the place, but we really didn't have a good handle on refrigeration. And the meat industry tried a whole bunch of different things to try to, in the most economical way, just like now. I mean, economics were pushing dietary, trends. We're trying very hard to ship first animals and then parts of animals all over the country in the most economical way possible. And it turns out that, especially when refrigeration is poor, the organs didn't ship. So they just didn't make it. And when animals weren't shipped any longer, especially people in cities did not have the same access to all the different parts of the animals as they did before. And at the same time, and this is incredibly unfortunate, we had a massive amount, this part's fortunate. We have a massive amount of immigration into this country. That's fantastic. And a lot of diversity of people all over the world. And most of those immigrant populations had offal in their traditional diets. In fact, loved offal. But as the context of their own environments changed and access to different materials changed and different sorts of foods changed, and status was also associated with price and the kinds of food you brought into your house, second generation, third generation immigrants wanted to eat the same kind of, generations from immigrant families wanted to eat the same sort of, really expensive food as the other people around them did. And as things like ribeye, where we keep bringing up and killing ribeye, keep getting more and more expensive, they're starting to shed some of these traditional approaches to food, and they starting to want to look like the people up on the hill.
It's incredible, Dr. Bill, learning from you, and as I transitioned out of the vegan diet to eating meats again, how profound the change was for me from going low oxalate. And I told the story recently, and I was interviewed by Dr. Baker, and I said I looked at the grocery store differently. I used to look at the plant section as the healthy section and then meat as death. It's completely flipped on its head now. I go in there and go, the plant section is like, oh, no, no, no. And then looking at meats in a completely different way as a nourishing source for my body. Talk to us a little bit about when our ancestors first started to include plants and how they dealt with some of the toxicities that are associated with plants. And we all know how you start the chapter in your book, that they should scare the hell out of you.
They should. Plants should scare the hell out of you. So plants were in our diets well before meat was. But what you need to understand, however, is that it wasn't like, plants in our diets prior to 3.5 million years ago wasn't like us just walking in the grocery store now and being able to grab whatever we wanted. The fact is, toxins have always been a huge issue. In fact, anybody who is watching that forages, which is, even though I don't eat a lot of plants, I love foraging. I've been foraging for, now 40 years, and I teach foraging classes all the time. Not because I think plants are that incredibly important to put into our diets, but more importantly, foraging is a way to connect with your food on a level that allows you to realize the real dangers in plants, benefits in plants as well, but also the real dangers in plants. Anybody that forages knows how incredibly dangerous plants can be, especially wild plants. These toxins are not there by mistake. They're there because the plants are trying to defend themselves. They're trying to reproduce viable offspring that reproduces viable offspring so the plants can survive just like every other species on the planet. So that means prior to 3.5 million years ago, prior to any sort of technology that allowed us to process a plant, what our ancestors had access to were number one, the plants that were low enough in their toxic load that our digestive tract could deal with them safely, which limits a whole bunch of, it takes most of the plants around them out of the possible range of food. Then on top of that, we have no storage capability, no shipping capability. So that means everything that they ate, number one, had to be very low in toxins, and it was hyper seasonal and it was hyper local. So the plants they had access to were very, very minimal. It wasn't, please don't have in your mind this picture of this Garden of Eden and everybody's just these, eating all these plants. They're eating very select plants that were ready to eat at certain times and only certain times, and had very low toxic loads and were very close to where they lived. But the crazy thing is, about 3.5 million years ago, we invented our first technology, which is stone tools. And we know for sure that was focused on animals because we found the butchered carcasses, the remains of that activity. But it started a spiral, the snowballing effect of technological innovation over the next 3.5 million years that was almost all directed towards our food supply. And what I love is when you really look at that, and look at the technologies, which is where all my research is focused. Look at the technologies and how do those technologies impact food and food choices and how food was, processed or dealt with up until the agricultural revolution. So from 3.5 million years ago up until about 12,000 years ago, almost every single technology invented went towards food at some level. And those towards animals went towards overcoming our physical limitations and taking the animal down. Like, being able to make spears and atlatls and bows and arrows and boomerangs and throwing sticks and traps and hooks and whatever, nets. Almost all of our effort into getting animals into our food supply went towards getting the animal. Once you have that animal, we talked about this just a few minutes ago, all you need is a sharp edge and open it, and you can extract a crazy amount of nutrition. Sure, if you want to cook the meat, it helps a little, but really just a massive pile of incredible nutrition is sitting in front of you once you take an animal down. Plants are something different. Getting plants is incredibly easy from the wild. I mean, most of the time you're picking things, or maybe you have a digging stick to get at some roots, maybe a sharp edge, just a knife to cut something, but getting the plant was easy. Almost all the technological innovation for literally, 3.5 million years that went towards plants went towards doing two things. One, making the plant safe to eat, and two, making the nutrients in the plants accessible to our incredibly inefficient digestive tract.
You hit on this in our recent past was the Victory Garden and the impact the Victory Garden had on us, prioritizing plants, and now with the agenda that has turned almost into a full-on vegan agenda for not only adults but kids in schools, which can be so problematic. Sure. I'm now I know what I know. I'm not as dogmatic as other folks, and if you want to have some plants that are, I think, on the toxicity spectrum or down low, please feel free to enjoy them. But when you talk about pushing all these foods on children without having any source of animal nutrition in there, which we know is so important in their brain development and all these other things, it can be really challenging. Sally and yourself talked about your own dealing with oxalates. I just want to talk about that for 5 minutes. I can tell you the transformational, there's a couple of people amongst yourself that I thank for literally saving my life. Sally Norton is number one, and when I interviewed her, I teared up because I really firmly believe I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. My illness was so severe, and I was so malnourished. Dr. Baker is the other for introducing me on how to eat meats in the carnivore diet, and then yourself and learning about our ancestral past. But with that being said, you talked about almonds and your journey with almonds. What happened? I know you had eye issues, and it was rough for you for a while.
Well, first off, that means more than you can imagine. Thank you. I'm glad I had an impact. One other thing you mentioned very quickly, I want to reference before we move on straight on to the oxalates is, these plants can be so incredibly dangerous that when we're in the middle of a diet that includes them at incredibly high levels, I think we sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that, you know, we're either healthier than we are, or that we are doing the right thing. So we kind of push through it. And one of the things we need to do is literally just listen to our bodies. The second thing is the Victory Garden piece is really important. And this is a real quick side note, but since we're talking about ancestral diets, this is very, very important. At the time, if you study the history of anthropology itself, you know, literally the history of anthropological thought and us sort of understanding other humans and archaeology, you know, one thing we'll notice is archaeology really starts in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And anthropological thought, you know, really diving in deep and trying to understand different groups around the world and people in the past, really is at its heyday at the same time that people are planting these victory gardens. And they become incredibly important. So one thing I want everybody to understand is that anthropology and archaeology, both of them are not hard sciences, right? They are prone to all sorts of influence from the outside world, from, you know, all sorts of different things. And what's happening in, you know, the general context of the time period when people are looking into the past influences how they interpret what they see. So at the time, you can imagine at the time, when it's no mystery why at the time that everybody is looking into the past and victory gardens are incredibly important, that a lot of the interpretations are very plant heavy for our ancestors, which is now getting turned certainly on its head. But I need people to understand that is just as important in influencing the interpretation of the past as the actual data itself. So yeah, Maya Angelou, real quick. Yes, she is amongst the top 3 people in the world too that have completely changed my life. Now, in addition to all sorts of other problems, for decades, I was suffering from massive amounts of metabolic disease, and much of it was unexplained. Like, I didn't know where it was coming from. I was trying all sorts of different diets, but the things that turned out to be answered when I first got in contact with Sally Norton, lowered the oxalates in my diet, those things were unexplained. Those were the things when I went to the doctors, they kind of dismissed, and they said no. I mean, I literally remember sitting in the doctor's office, and the guy I have corneal transplants that took place over 20 years ago, but this is only, 8 years ago or so. I'm sitting in his office. My eyes were so light sensitive that I couldn't keep them open. I couldn't drive. I couldn't even watch TV with 2 pairs of sunglasses on. I'm sitting there I have 2 people trying to hold my eyes open as he's looking through his little machine into my eyes, telling me there's nothing wrong with me. I'm literally just tears running down my face. He's like, there's nothing wrong with you. I can't keep my eyes open, doctor. Well, there's nothing wrong with you. You must be crazy. And I'm like, crazy? What's wrong? So from everything from pseudo gout to corneal issues with light sensitivity, pain in different parts of my body. I mean, the list can go on and on, but these are the things that impacted my daily life. And just as importantly, mental well-being, which I wish more people were talking about as well. Like, I had these pains, I had these issues. They impacted me on a lot of different levels. But on top of that, the fact that it was, the weighing on my mind of this pain, and the fact that doctors couldn't explain it, the fact that I was getting dismissed regularly and on, were all, weighing mentally on me, and I was a wreck. And I'm telling you, a 5-minute conversation with Sally Norton changed my life and started me on a track to what I'm experiencing now. And I know everybody's experience with oxalates are different, but every single thing that was unexplained, this is my own personal experience, every single thing that was bothering me for, in some cases, decades is now gone.
I literally was consuming the highest. At my worst and at my sickest, I was malnourished and down to 127 pounds, emaciated, brain fogged. I literally I was so arthritic, I had to wear braces on my arms. I couldn't get out of bed. It happened all around the time of the pandemic. I lost my job, had no insurance, and I started Googling and came across Sally's presentation called Lost Seasonality and the Overconsumption of Plants. And that, even in my brain fogged mind, it lit something in me that I could have been doing this all incorrectly. I was literally doing smoothies filled with spinach, chia seeds, turmeric three times a day and bombing my poor digestive tract. And it was anyway, like you, I really thank her for all the research that she's doing. And I recently posted something called the escalation of commitment bias. And you talked about it a little bit right there. And what that talks to is that, on the vegan diet, you have so many folks that are feeling terrible, but the word is out on Google and from my own doctor that this was the healthiest diet, this is the way to go. So you keep hammering on at it, meaning you're thinking success is just around the corner. Oh, one more day. You're committed to this way dogmatically, and you get sort of narrow view on things. And what I appreciate about your book, Eat Like a Human, is it widens the scope of what we're supposed to be consuming as humans. And I really appreciate that. And I'm going to use this opportunity now to just segue for a couple of minutes before we go on to dairy, which is another subject that I love. But your thoughts on, and there's a couple of questions I'll put in here on grains and maize. Now, a couple of the plants that we're talking about, corn, and you also referenced tomatoes, now are completely different than our ancestors ate, and you talk about it a lot in the book. The versions we have now are much less nutrient dense. So how can folks, if they wish to, consume grains and maize safely?
Okay, so a couple of things. Number one, there is a fantastic book called Eating on the Wild Side. If anybody's interested in looking at the nutrient value of plants as they've changed through the past couple of decades, and what to do to make sure you're maximizing the nutrition of the plants. If you're eating plants today, this is a fantastic book, Eating on the Wild Side. The first chapter is about foraging, and everything else is about domesticated plants you can get at the grocery store. Listen, there's a lot of reasons not to eat plants, a ton. And if we're looking at just biological nutrition and safety in our food system, then there's no reason to eat plants whatsoever. However, this is something as a father and now as a restaurant and food production facility owner, I see that's not the reality for so many people, that they love plants. Either they're talked into thinking that they should love plants, and it's been a part of their life for 50, 60, 70 years, and they're not going to give up plants, or there's just something culturally about including plants, or organoleptically, they like the flavor, they like the texture, they like whatever. There's reasons that people eat plants. So the question now is, like what you just posed to me, if you're going to eat plants, what is the safest and most nourishing way to do it? Well, number one, understand that there are parts of plants that are typically, because I know this gets very complicated, but we'll do the Cliff's Notes version here, typically less toxic than other plants. And for the most part, we're looking at flowers and fruits. Flowers and fruits, the plant puts a lot of energy into attracting other animals to it. They want pollinators to come to plants. They want animals to come to fruits and eat it and consume it and deposit the seeds in a pile of manure somewhere else to propagate their species. So typically, when we're talking about toxins, I'm not talking about sugar content and all that other stuff, which is important, but as far as toxins are concerned, flowers and fruits are typically very, very, very low in toxins. On the other hand, other parts of the plant itself are trying to put a lot of effort into protecting. Like, they don't want their leaves to get eaten. They don't want their stem to get eaten. They don't want their roots or their energy source to get eaten. And they certainly don't want their babies to get eaten. So, if we think from that perspective, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds are the babies of the plant. And they're typically heavily defended through chemicals. And in order, if you're going to eat them, number one, understand that every single one of them have toxins. And in some cases are really high in toxins. If you're going to consume them, the first thing we have to do is trick those parts of the plant into thinking they're in an environment where they can let down their senses and sprout and create new life. Those the toxins and the anti-nutrients that are surrounding all of those parts of the plants are there to, again, protect it, but also to make sure it stays dormant until it's in the right environment to sprout. So, one example I always say is you could take a wheat berry, a good wheat berry, stick it on a counter in, right now it's 65 degrees in this room and it's super dry, and come back in 10,000 years and plant it. And it'll produce new life. And the reason it will do that is because it's so heavily defended. But what happens when you're fooling it into thinking, or actually when it does sprout, is that it lets those defenses down. It actually has to let most of those defenses down in order to support new life. So things like soaking, sprouting, and fermenting are great ways to, again, fool it into thinking it's letting that it's there and it'll do it. As far as grains are concerned, 100% wild, long fermented sourdough bread is in my mind, the best way to eat grains. In fact, now there's one even better. Sprouted grains that have been turned into flour to do that are the ideal. I don't eat a lot of bread, but when I do, it is always 100% sourdough. A couple of very quick side notes for anybody who's either making it themselves or buying it. It is almost always fake in the grocery store. If you, and here's a couple of tricks to understand what it is you're buying. There is no FDA regulation in this country that regulations you have to meet in order to call something sourdough. It is just a label. You can just say it's the same thing as a food manufacturer calling something red. Like there's no, or whatever. So if it says sourdough, don't think it's sourdough. If it's from a grocery store, 99% of the time, it's not sourdough. So if you turn over the package and look on the back, if there's anything that looks acidic, like acetic acid, which is vinegar, or they could say vinegar, or citric acid or lactic acid, then what they've done is they've taken the term sourdough and our misunderstanding as consumers that sourdough bread is supposed to taste sour. It's not. It can, but it doesn't have to. And they've made some regular yeasted bread just taste a little bit sour. If it has any of those, put it back. If it says they've added commercial yeast, if yeast is on the ingredient, unless it says wild yeast, put it back. If it says something like baking soda or some kind of chemical leavener, which is what happens typically with pretzels, sourdough pretzels, and you look on the back, it's literally flour, water, salt, and baking soda. Put it back. Those are not sourdough breads. They're the same. Even if they're in brown packages and the price is a little bit higher and you can see through it and it looks like it's scored and it looks all pretty, it's in the deli section and at the other side of the grocery store from where most of the sliced bread is, it's not real bread. The real sourdough bread. The only way to ensure that you get real sourdough bread is to either get it from a baker you know and trust or make it at home. It is not that difficult to make. But the other thing I wanted to mention is sourdough kind of took off with the pandemic, and I'm thrilled it has. I mean, it's really empowered a lot of home bakers to do stuff. And now, finally some people are understanding, sourdough can be a little bit healthier than regular bread. It actually is a lot healthier than regular bread. There's a lot of recipes on the internet for sourdough everything, sourdough cookies, sourdough muffins, sourdough whatever. Unfortunately, what most of those recipes do is they take a regular chocolate chip cookie recipe and they stick in a little bit of sourdough mother and then call it sourdough cookies. What you need to understand is that if you are going to take and make that recipe fully fermented and make sure all the grains have gone through the fermentation process, it has to ferment after you've added that mother in. So if it says, hey, add a little bit of sourdough mother, then 2 cups of flour, then make it into cookies and put it in the oven and bake it, that 2 cups of flour, nothing's changed about those grains. The majority of the flour you're eating in this recipe, you might as well just go on to the grocery store and bought a chocolate chip cookie. So there's a lot of techniques you can use, but you got to understand it's the bacterial fermentation that coincides with the yeast fermentation and sourdough bread baking that transforms the grains into something special. And you mentioned maize. What's done with maize is the exact opposite. When you ferment most grains through a sourdough process, you're using the bacteria to do a lot of things, but it also creates lactic acid, which drops the pH, which means it becomes more acidic. And when you get down to below the 4.6 range, all the magic really happens. 7, for those who don't remember, 6, 7th grade science class, 7 is neutral. As the numbers get lower, you're on the pH scale, it gets more acidic. And when it gets higher, it becomes more alkaline or more basic. There's a lot of fermentations, traditional fermentations that go in the other direction. And as you become more alkaline, you can get a lot of special things happening as well. The quick story about maize is that maize or corn is one of the most difficult grains for the human body to digest and derive nutrition from. Anybody who's eaten corn on the cob in the summer and seen whole kernels of corn the next morning in the toilet know that those grains were not digested whatsoever. They took a free ride on our digestive tract. And they should have, because the job of the grains are to survive the digestive tract of the animals eating the plant, so it can get deposited. They're physically designed that way. I mean, think about what most seeds look like. They look like a torpedo. And they look like a torpedo, so they can go right through your digestive tract. And they're heavily protected chemically. And here we are as humans trying to derive nutrition from these plants that are physically and chemically protected, for their seeds and their nuts and all this. But maize is incredibly difficult to fully digest, derive the nutrition. There's only one way, and we figured out how to take a kernel of maize or corn and make it completely bioavailable to the human body. That's this process called nixtamalization. We know nixtamalization is 4,000 years old. 2 years ago, we developed an archaeological technique to directly identify it in the archaeological record. And I'm confident if you keep an eye out in the next few years, we're going to see that number go back to probably 8, 9, 10,000 years ago for the development of that technology. Again, same thing. We can get fooled quite a bit. If you're eating corn meal, stop, because you're just getting carbohydrates, and most of the nutrition that comes from it is going directly out of your body. If you do want to put corn into your diet, the safest, most nutrient dense, and bioavailable way to do it is to ensure that the grains have been through this process called nixtamalization.
So dairy, really an important one for me, because for a while as a vegan, when I was trying to reintroduce dairy, meaning not the nut-based, which I don't think is dairy at all or shouldn't be called milk in any way, shape, or form, trying to introduce natural dairy back, I had a lot of aversion to it. I was reacting to normal dairy. And then, I read your book and the importance of fermentation and in our ancestral past for dairy, and, the lactose and the enzymes that we had, historically breaking down. You talk about we consumed it at least 49,000 years ago, but we really began consuming it about 8 to 10,000 years ago when we started domesticating animals. And we weren't drinking it. We were making cheese and kefir, which I really appreciate. Now I include kefir every morning. I absolutely love it. Can you talk to us a little bit how, we sort of lost that ability over the years, and how important the fermentation process is?
So very, very quickly, well, everybody needs to understand too that the lactose intolerance thing that we see in the human population is not a weird thing. In fact, 60% of modern humans around the world are lactose intolerant. What's weird is that some of us are lactose tolerant. The 40% of us that are lactose tolerant are actually descendants of from a couple of different groups from thousands of years ago that had a genetic mutation that allowed them to continue to produce lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, into adulthood. So if anybody is weird in this, it's the people like me who have developed this. In our past, we had this genetic mutation. It happened in groups that had a strong reliance on dairy, and you can imagine the evolutionary pressures that allowed this to happen. So when we think about dairy, a couple of things I think are important. Number one is that just like all other mammals, when we are weaned off our mothers, we begin to lose the ability to efficiently and safely consume dairy. Now, this doesn't mean that right away, if I stop there, all of a sudden I just fueled the anti-milk arguments like, well, then we shouldn't be drinking dairy. Well, no. When you ask me about any food, should we eat this? I kind of break down. I'm like, well, that's a complicated answer. The question we should be asking is how should we eat this food to make it as safe and nourishing as possible? How should we approach this food? That's a better question. When you ask it like that, then everything starts to fall into a different place in different categories. We look at the world a little bit differently. Like grains, the mainstay of vegan diets, the technological input required to store, plant, tend, harvest, process, store, distribute, grind, mix, ferment, bake, slice that bread, make all those grains and then turn it into bread is unbelievable. All as far as dairy, so should we be eating grains? Like seriously, when you look at the technological input required to eat grains, then we really have a conversation in front of us. When we look at dairy, the only thing that we need to do to dairy is, number one, get the highest quality raw dairy possible. But secondly, is ferment it. Literally, the only thing we need to do to that dairy to replicate how our body digested it when we were infants, perfectly designed to consume it and make it as safe and nourishing as possible, is take raw dairy out of the animal, like milk the animal, and sit it on a counter and stand back and watch it for about 24 hours. It will spontaneously ferment. It's already filled with all the bacteria needed to allow that fermentation to happen. And magic happens in that vessel over the next 12 to 24 hours. It is fully fermented. It is what's happening inside of our bodies when we're consuming it directly from our mothers. It is the same thing that happens when we're making kefir, when we're making clabber, when we're making traditional cheeses, when we're making real yogurts, and the list goes on and on. That's all we have to do. So if you want to talk about technological input, it's not that much. The other problem is when we talk about dairy is we just like you and I used to walk into the grocery store and look at the produce section and think this is where health really begins, or is supported. A lot of us, I think, look at the dairy aisle and think that that's like one of the most unadulterated sections of the grocery store. I mean, everything is white and pristine, and there's pictures of farms on the labels, and oh my gosh, that is unprocessed, unmessed with food. And the reality is that is one of the most franken-food section. It doesn't even belong on the outside of the grocery store. It belongs in the middle next to the Oreos and the Keebler crackers, because that dairy has been completely adulterated. And most of it's not even milk anymore anyhow. But when I talk about dairy and making healthy decisions focused on dairy, including healthy dairy in our diets, number one, the gold standard is fermented raw dairy from a good farm. There is such a thing, and this is why I love being able to dive a little bit deeper into these conversations. There is such a thing as bad raw dairy. I mean, there was a reason in our historical past why the milk was making people sick. It was because it was bad raw dairy. The only thing that pasteurization does is make bad milk not kill somebody. It doesn't turn bad milk magically into good milk. It takes bad milk and makes it not kill somebody. It's a completely different thing. So if we're talking about the gold standard, again, it's raw dairy from a good farm. To me, first of all, I'm in Maryland. It is completely illegal to have raw dairy here, or to sell raw dairy here. The raw dairy that I've been feeding my family with has come from Pennsylvania, from good farmers. And sort of my criteria is A, I can go directly to the farm and get it. B, I know the farmer by name. He's met my kids. He or she has met my kids. They can name their cows, which means that the herd is small enough, and I'm able to come in and see the operation. That is an incredibly connected and safe food system. And that's how I choose my raw dairy. But I do realize, for a number of different reasons, some of them legal, some of them economic, that raw dairy is not an option for a lot of people, especially in this country. So what's the next step? The next step for me, number one, you can make an argument that, again, pasteurization makes bad milk not kill somebody. So you can kind of, in a convoluted way, make a safety argument for pasteurization. But there's no reason to homogenize. The only reason milk has been homogenized is because the dairy industry takes the cream, tells you, tricks you into thinking you should drink skim milk and not have the fat. And then there's a ton of money in fat. Butter, ice cream, ton of money in fat. They take off the cream, try to sell you skim milk and 2% milk and take the cream. But there was a time when milk was valued by the fat content in it. The fat content of milk varies depending on season, depending on what animal it is, how good their diet is, and also how much is being skimmed off the top. So the dairy industry started homogenizing to hide the fact that this bottle of milk from this person, this bottle of milk from this person had different levels of fat on it. It's also to make it easier for us so that we don't have to shake it in the morning before we put it on our coffee. So make sure you should never drink homogenized milk. Our body cannot recognize the fats that have been exploded to homogenize the milk. Not homogenized, so drink creamline or non-homogenized milk. The highest fat content possible. Understand too that whole milk is not the total amount of fat. It doesn't contain the same amount of fat that actually came out of that cow. They're still skimming off fat from that milk to put it into other things. And there's a minimum standard needed, which is usually what it is when you get the whole milk. So, and also the level of pasteurization is very important. If you can find low temperature pasteurized milk, that is the next best thing to raw. That means that they very gently, the minimum amounts needed to legally, abide by their state laws, they've minimally heated that milk in order to make it to meet those standards. Never ultra pasteurized milk and ultra high temperature pasteurized milk, to me, is something we should never put in our human bodies. And as a cheese maker and dairy fermenter, you can't, because the proteins are so screwed up from that pasteurization process at that level, you cannot make cheese out of it. And if making cheese, and this is a part of a larger conversation, but making cheese is literally, again, replicating the process, the biological processes that we all went through as mammals, as infants. If we can't even put that milk through that process, then there's something wrong with that milk, and it shouldn't be in our bodies. And then finally, the last piece is the gold standard You get the best milk you can possibly get. And you know what? You do the best you can. So you get the best milk you can get, feel very, very good about it, and then ferment it.
Tying into the dairy side, one of the questions that came in was, is it possible to make a healthy version of American cheese? Can you do that?
Absolutely not. There's no way. Listen, real cheese is made through the fermentation process. That fermentation process makes use of incredible lactobacillus bacteria that is eating the lactose and transforming that dairy chemically and physically into something else, into something that's different. In addition to it being safer and more nutritious, it also changes the flavor and the texture and the aroma in very pleasing ways. So that's what happens in the traditional cheese making process. The only things you need to make cheese are high quality milk, the bacteria, rennet, which is the enzyme that comes from the stomach of unweaned mammals, and salt. That's it. And the cheesemaker does a bunch of different things, controls the environment, and it produces different kinds of cheese. American cheese requires blender-like equipment and vegetable oils in order to make it. And it's actually an emulsion. It's an emulsion like mayonnaise. It uses very terrible oils. It melts. I know that it melts really well and makes your hamburgers look good, but it is not worth it. Absolutely not worth it. One quick aside: if you want to mimic, if you want to eat, if you want to eat a hamburger or something with really good melted cheese on it, and you don't want to eat American cheese, which you shouldn't do, get the youngest cheese you could possibly get. There's a reason. It has to do with the pH. But I know, and I don't mind going over a minute, but I got to tell a very, very quick story. I was at college. I was homesick, and I really wanted to make a grilled cheese like my grandmother used to make. It was a specialty in my childhood, and she used to make this grilled cheese that on really hearty bread that had a curry powder on it and mayonnaise. So me and my roommates, we put all our money together and went and bought the best block of cheddar cheese at Kroger. And this was in Columbus, Ohio. So we got like the oldest, like however many month aged cheddar cheese. And I came in and we got this bread and this mayonnaise and we made it. And I was so proud. And I put it on there and it wouldn't melt. It was like this chunky, nasty stuff on the cheese. And it was the most expensive cheese in the whole place. And it turns out, as that cheese ages, the pH continues to drop. The young cheddar is nailed at about a pH of about 5.2, which is an optimal pH for melting. So if you want to mimic American cheese but not do it, get a very, very young cheddar.
One question that came in is any coffee experiences in travel, and does it have an optimal preparation from your historical aspect of it? I know sort of Dave Asprey touches a lot on the mold toxicities that it can be associated with. And any other ones for preparing it that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So the quick version of my optimal travel experience with coffee was when we were filming the third episode for The Great Human Race, we were in Ethiopia. Yeah. And Ethiopia is the heart of coffee. And every time we went somewhere, we were there for several weeks. And we were there for several weeks in advance of filming. And when we filmed, what you saw on TV is what you got. I mean, we were doing what you saw. But prior to that, the week leading up to filming, we weren't sleeping in a cave. We were sleeping in a tent or whatever, and we were getting things prepared. So we were traveling around the Bali Mountain area, this mountains in Ethiopia, and we were at this village. And at the top of this mountain, on the side of this mountain, there was a village of native bamboo, and this beautiful community, indigenous community, made all of their houses out of bamboo. It didn't look like it should be in Ethiopia, but it was awesome. And we had to get some kind of supply there. I forget why the reason we were there. And anyhow, they said, will you stay for, this is through translators, will you stay for coffee? Again, it's this bamboo village in the middle of nowhere in Ethiopia. And I'm like, I don't really need some coffee. And our director was like, no. And our director actually used to work on a show called Dangerous Grounds about coffee. He's like, no, you want this coffee. Like, you want this coffee. And we sat down, and it was this entire ceremony built around just drinking a cup of coffee. And it was beautiful, and it was magical, and it was, to me, my memory of it is it was the best coffee I've ever had in my life. And I don't care what I drink from this point forward, it will always be the best coffee I had in my life, which brings up a very good point. Maybe it was, maybe the flavor was, but the context, the community, the history, the tradition around that cup of coffee, building it together with somebody is what made it so special. So my first answer to your question is, as with any food, the context surrounding the preparation and consumption and sharing and enjoyment of that food is just as important for nourishment as the actual nutrients in that food itself, or the flavor or the aroma or the texture. The second thing, however, though, that a more practical answer is yes, the highest quality coffee in the world. There's several ways to take that, the bean from the bush, from the plant, and turn it into coffee. The highest quality coffee in the world goes through a fermentation process. That fermentation process helps a lot with making not only that bean safer, but also the really high quality flavor and aroma of that coffee.
Dr. Bill, what do you enjoy eating on a daily basis? What does your diet look like, and your exercise routine?
I truly am enjoying the best health of my life, which I owe 100% to my diet, my exercise regime, and also surrounding myself with the people that I love. All those things together has really drastically created the life that I'm enjoying now. As far as food and exercise are concerned, and I'll throw sleep in there very quickly as well. Typically, my wife and I do intermittent fast. We have a shortened eating window, partially because we found that our bodies respond really well to it, but also because it works really well in our daily, the way we separate our day. And it's also what I observed from almost every group that I've spent time with, whether they were hunter-gatherers, whether they were pastoralists, but every indigenous and traditional group I've spent time with just automatically practice some level of intermittent fasting. So we do that. I do include a complete nose-to-tail approach to animals in my diet. I haven't stepped on a scale in probably 8 years, in a good way, and I don't monitor my fat intake. My fat is 100% coming from animal sources if I'm cooking, and I don't monitor it. I eat it. If it's there and I put it in, I love the flavor of it. It helps me be satiated with my meals, so I eat fat and animals. Again, when I include animals in my diet, I do it like we mentioned earlier, that it is, I don't try to overthink it. It's the fact that we're bringing in whole animals or half animals or doing the hunting ourselves help us figure out what we should and shouldn't be eating and in that right percentage, but I don't overthink it. The plants that I include in a lot of dairy as well, and it's always fermented. I haven't drank a glass of milk in probably 15 years. So kefir, high quality yogurt. When we make our yogurt, we ferment it for 24 hours, which ensures that there's no lactose in it whatsoever, which is important for those of you who are lactose intolerant, but also important for those of you who are eating a ketogenic diet. There is sugar in dairy, but that shouldn't scare you, because if it's fermented, remember the lactose, the sugar in the milk is the food for the bacteria. So a fully fermented dairy product has little or no sugar in it whatsoever, no lactose at all. We love cheese. When we're consuming vegetables, we're very particular about what we consume. So we're already choosing the lowest toxic versions of the food, and they're always processed in some way, right? So things like, and usually that method is fermentation. So I love sauerkraut. I'll eat sauerkraut, and again, other sort of fermented foods. And I do drink coffee, and I probably drink a little more coffee than I should. As far as exercise is concerned, one thing that I found is I was a Division I wrestler and wrestling athletics were a major part of my life. And I came from that mindset of, when I was wrestling for Ohio State, we were working out minimum 3 times a day. And I have that mindset now, like if I want to work out, I gotta work out at all costs. And I really found that exercise, especially resistance training, is incredibly important, but so is sleep. And so is enjoying your life in a lot of other ways. So this is what we do now. My wife and I, we're working really hard building the Modern Sun Age Kitchen and the Eastern Shore Food Lab. We're spending a lot of time doing it. We do go for a run, not really long runs. We'll do a 3 or 5 mile run, and that's when we talk, right? There's no other, we can't look at our phones. We can't do something. That's when we actually talk and connect with one another. Every morning I do push-ups, pull-ups, and sit-ups. And we do resistance training as fast as we can. And I remember not as fast as we can. We're in there and we get our work done in the gym, because we want to come home and experience, again, the other parts of life. I remember that when I was a kid reading muscle and fitness magazines over and over again, one of my favorite Mr. Olympias would, the story about him was that he would go into the gym and literally do one set of each exercise. Like everybody else is in there 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, just literally camping out in the gym. He would go in and he was so disciplined that he could force his body to the point he needed to with one set. That's how hard he worked out. And he got in and he got out. And
Dr. Bill, talk to folks about where they can find you, about the Modern Stone Age Kitchen. I'm committed. I'm going to come visit you guys in Maryland and the Eastern Shore Food Lab and what you do there. Where can they find you?
Great. So we're located in Chestertown, Maryland on the Eastern Shore. It's a beautiful part of the country. We're in that little strip of land between the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And I think we're really uniquely located because we are only, it's a very rural, beautiful area, but we're only 2 hours from New York City, an hour from Philadelphia, an hour from Washington, D.C. So it's very easy to get to us. We have what we learned, my wife and I, in how to feed ourselves and how to feed our family was so important. We just wanted to find a way to share it with the rest of the world. We do a lot of social media things, and we wrote the book. But on top of that, we wanted to actually share the food itself. So we built the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which is based literally on the book we spent this hour talking about. The recipes from that book became the foundation of this restaurant. If you looked on paper, it should have never worked, but it did. I mean, people are coming for the right reasons, and everything that we make here is made 100% from scratch, which means we have complete control over the process of taking a raw ingredient and turning it into its safest and most nourishing form possible. So there's no two ingredients put together outside of these walls. Christina, me, and our team, we have 19 people now working here, create everything from scratch. The butter, the cheese, we do in-house nose-to-tail butchering. We ferment our vegetables. All our grains are fermented or nixtamalized, 100% from scratch. We don't use any industrial nut and seed oils. We don't use any refined sugars. And all of our dairy is fermented. All the things we just spent the last hour talking about, we're using those processes to create real nourishing food for the community. On top of that, and we also, so if anybody's interested in it, you can find out information there. You can follow us on social media at Modern Stone Age Kitchen. You can find us on the internet at www.modernstoneagekitchen.com, and you can come to visit us and get the food, but we also ship. On top of that, even though we love creating food for the community, our number one passions are inspiring and educating people to do it themselves. So on top of the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, where I'm coming to you at right now, is the Eastern Shore Food Lab, which is our nonprofit. And that is all of our teaching, all of our research, and all of our outreach is funneled through here. So we do all sorts of classes on cheese making, sourdough bread baking, nose-to-tail butchering and cooking, fermenting, cheese making, all of those things we do in person, and we also have online and live versions of that. In fact, I want to leave.
Sure.
I want to leave you with one thing real quick in a second. You can find out information there at easternshorefoodlab.com, my website, eatlikeahuman.com, and you can follow us online at Dr. Bill Schindler, so Dr. Bill Schindler, and also ES Food Lab. But this is the thing I'll leave you with. I'm so excited. I have one of the things that we're trying to do is to take real familiar food that people are used to eating and turn it into its safest and most nourishing form possible, right? And because I'm convinced that it's by transforming the foods that we eat every day into those forms, that's how day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, we're going to make real significant changes in the health of entire families. So it isn't just, chicken liver pate, which we make and we love it, but it isn't just like an organ meat pate sort of thing that we're doing. We're making pizzas from scratch in incredibly nourishing forms. We're doing all sorts of things. But one of the things that I've wanted to be able to do, and I just finally nailed it after years, is to make a complete nose to tail hot dog that we truly believe in, that kids actually like. And we did it. This hot dog, just like in the book, we took a typical beef cow and all the percentages of anything that I can legally get, we put into this hot dog in the same percentage. So eating this hot dog is like starting on one end of a cow and eating right through it. And we nailed it. And we're going to start offering it very soon here. But more importantly, because I know a lot of people aren't going to be able to visit us, the director from the National Geographic show, The Great Human Race, is a good friend of mine. He has a production company now. They were down here last week, and we filmed how to make that hot dog at home.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Bill, for taking the time out today and spending it with us and chatting. It's been an absolute honor, sir. And I just want to leave with one more note that you talk about in the book, is that start the revolution in your kitchen and around your table. And I think that's a really good way to end out today's show. Thank you, sir.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Carnivorist Chats. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for listening, and also thank you in advance for liking, subscribing, or sharing this episode. Thanks again to the good folks at Carnivore Bar and Equip Foods. Don't forget to check the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products. And also, don't forget you can book me for a 30-minute carnivore coaching session through Avero Health. Again, the link will be in the show notes. Until the next time, be well.